Aloha, a wonderful day to everyone. It is 2 p.m. here in Hawaii. It is 9 a.m. in the Philippines, and it is 1 a.m. in the UK. Welcome to the Center for Philippine Studies first colloquium this fall 2022. I would like to introduce our director, Professor Pia Arboleda, who will do the introductions. Professor Arboleda.
Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. Under the leadership of Dr. Belinda Aquino, the Center for Philippine Studies established the CPS Colloquium series that aims to provide a venue for scholars in the field of Filipino and Philippine studies to share ideas and to engage in critical discourse. This is the first lecture of the series, as Ms. Clem has mentioned, and it is a good prequel to our martial law colloquium series that will be launched in March with a lecture by none other than Dr. Belinda Aquino herself. Throughout the year, we will hold lectures that provide recollections and reflections on martial law 50 years after its declaration. Speakers in that series include Patricia Abenales, Dexter Callanes, Josen Diaz, and Mark Sanchez. Today's speaker is Senior Lecturer in Creative Writing and Journalism at the University of Portsmouth. Tom lived in Quezon City from 2009 to 2010 and has been visiting and researching the Philippines ever since. His latest book is Imagining Manila, Literature, Empire, and Orientalism, a post-colonial analysis of Western literary and media discourses on the city of Manila dating back several centuries. Amongst other things, Imagining Manila engages with the following themes: the construction of Chinese Filipinos as a supranational stereotype shaped by Western attitudes to Chinese within the Filipinos, Chinese immigration to the West, and the changing geopolitical role of China. The representation of Manila as a hell-like supernatural textual space informed by Hispanophobia, religious bigotry, and third world blues, according to Pratt. Another theme is the late 19th and early 20th century colonial adventure novels' deployment of rhetorical devices and genderized motifs to sanitize, ignore, or justify U.S. misconduct in the Philippine-American War. And lastly, the hypocrisy and cognitive dissonance of Western state corporate media coverage of the authoritarian and violent Duterte regime. In 2018, Tom published The Realm of the Punisher, Travels in Duterte's Philippines, a political travelogue on the contemporary Philippines that earned good reviews from the London magazine. The book featured interviews with land and indigenous rights activists, authors from F. Shonil Jose to Charleston Ong, the anti-war artist Kublai Milan, a man who claimed to have been Ferdinand Marcos's body double, and a former comfort woman or sex slave to the Japanese military war during World War II. Tom writes regularly about Philippine current affairs for Private Eye, Britain's biggest selling political magazine, and his other journalism on the country has appeared in the London Telegraph, Monocle, Southeast Asia Globe, Morning Star, and many others. So without further ado, dear friends, please welcome Dr. Tom Sykes.
Thank you so much, Professor Pia, for that introduction and for inviting me to this seminar. It's a real honor to be with you. It's as we mentioned earlier, it's quite early in the morning here, so my brain isn't functioning as efficiently as it should do. So if I descend into sort of stream of consciousness or any other kind of incoherence, just shout at me and I'll try and get back on track. So yes, the title of my talk is Getting Manila Wrong Since 1840, Flawed Simulations, Third World Blues, and Other Western Literary Misrepresentations. It's a slightly provocative title, I'll give you that, but maybe a slightly absolutist one as well, because what I hope to kind of show to you is that, or explain to you in this talk, is that the discourse that I'm sort of looking at in the book, which I call Manilaism, is actually sort of quite nuanced, and there's a sort of spectrum of rightness and wrongness, if you like, to the sort of representations that I'm going to look at. Now, Manilaism is also a slight sort of tongue twister to pronounce, but I chose it because it relates quite closely lexically to Orientalism, which is obviously Edward Said's sort of conception of certain kind of Western literary discourses about the Middle East, which was his sort of main focus. And what I've done is to sort of adapt some of Said's observations and propositions to the context of, you know, Western writing about the Philippines. I've also been inspired by other scholars very much, including Alain Gros-Richard, who was a French philosopher of the 1970s, who brought out a book a year after Orientalism came out in 1979 called The Sultan's Court, which was really an analysis of a lot of French Enlightenment era writers and their sort of comments about Orientalist despotism, what they called Oriental despotism, rather. And just reading that book, which on the surface is completely unrelated to the Philippines, I was struck by how many of these sorts of French writers were kind of using the same sort of motifs and the same sorts of, you know, were exhibiting the same sorts of attitudes as a lot of the kind of Western writing on Manila and the Philippines that I was looking at. Also been inspired by others that I'll sort of name check as I go along, including Neferti Tadiar, the Filipina cultural theorist whose ideas around fantasy production and the sort of ideological uses and abuses of dreams and fantasies in the Philippines. Her focus is mostly in the sort of Philippine cultural context, but a lot of those ideas have sort of percolated into these outsiders, these Westerners that have written about the Philippines too. So I've tried to bring some of that into my analysis. Also interested in the work of Martin Green, the structuralist literary critic who did some important work in the early 80s to try to define and delineate the colonial adventure story. And colonial adventure stories are quite a big part of this discourse. And in terms of the more contemporary observations that I tried to make, or the observations I make about contemporary Manilaism and its focus on, you know, for example, the Duterte regime, I'm interested in the work of Pankaj Mishra, the Indian essayist, whose book Age of Anxiety is an interesting explication of this notion that neoliberalism has sort of begets authoritarianism and neo-fascism in various cultural contexts, and I've tried to apply that to an understanding of some of the Western writing about Duterte. So, according to my findings, this Manilaist discourse goes back 4 centuries, but really it's in the mid-19th century, which is why I chose 1840 for the title as an approximate date, when you start to get a significant number of works published that, you know, it's at that point when we can start to talk about this as a coherent discourse. And this is quite simple, not to be too sort of reductionist and vulgar materialist about this, but really this is triggered by the fact that the Philippines becomes of imperial interest to the United States and to a certain extent the United Kingdom, also to other European powers as well. Germany had an interest in the late 19th century in taking over the Philippines. Obviously, as we know now, with the benefit of hindsight, that actually ultimately what happened was that the United States annexed the Philippines. But yeah, so it really starts in the 19th century, and you can trace this trajectory of Western letters up to the present day. In terms of the genres and forms that I'm looking at, I'm quite pluralistic about it in the way that Said was, in terms of the stuff that he looked at in Orientalism. So I'm interested in certain types of Western journalism, memoir, travel writing, what you might call creative nonfiction or life writing, and also certain fictions that are of a kind of realist bent, that are sort of making, or seem to be making, truth claims about Manila. So yes, it's, as I say, it's quite a broad and diverse range of sources that I've looked at. And essentially in various ways, this is by no means a uniform or kind of homogeneous discourse. In various ways, these texts have tried to construct Manila as a textual space founded on various assumptions which are imperialist or colonialist or neo-imperialist or neo-colonialist, depending on the sort of era that we're looking at, and certainly have a measure of ethnocentrism about them, and very often a kind of a blunt sort of sense of cultural and racial supremacism about them. That can be very overt in many cases, certainly, as you can imagine if you're not already familiar with the sort of late 19th, early 20th century colonial fictions that I look at. You can, it'd be pretty obvious that there is some sort of pretty odious kind of white supremacism in the pages of those books. But I'm actually more interested on the other side of that spectrum, which is more what I would call the sort of covert sort of liberal Orientalism, and the ways in which the sort of through euphemism and through a sort of what seems to be a kind of a humanitarian and empathetic language and vocabulary, certain kinds of imperialistic sorts of notions are advanced. I'm interested in looking at, this is, a work of literary criticism, I guess, or literary history. So I'm interested in the way that certain literary devices operate to actuate these sorts of themes, these sorts of ideas. So I'm interested in representational models that writers seem to kind of keep calling back to and recapitulate through history. I'm interested in specific tropes, specific motifs and images of both people and places related to Manila. Not that you can make an easy distinction between them, because of course a place is always full of people, despite the sort of terra nullis kind of myth that a lot of imperialists, have kind of pushed over the years. But there's a kind of preoccupation, as you can imagine, with certain powerful individuals, whether it's Marcos in the sort of 70s or 80s, a lot of Westerners, a lot of journalists across the world were obviously interested in covering this particular figure. More recently, Duterte, and going further back in time, revolutionary leaders, what we might call the sort of have often been called the sort of cacique leaders of the Philippines, from sort of Aguinaldo and Bonifacio onwards. I'm also very interested in particular rhetorical devices that have been used in service of this particular discourse, and certain kinds of narrative strategies, and I'll get into a bit more detail about those shortly. The first and most sort of dramatic representational model that I deal with in the book is what I call Manila as hell. And this is nothing new, really. It invokes a pretty long trajectory of Western writing, limning other cities as hell-like. This arguably goes back at least as far as to Dante and the city of Dis, the sort of hellish, infernal city of Dis. We can talk about, Dickensian London, or, the way that the sort of Victorian London is limned by Dickens as being this kind of a different type of hellish place, full of sin and vice and corruption and crime and so forth. So there's a sort of literary fallback. There are, this particular, as I say, this particular sort of representational model links to other representational models that have really nothing to do with Manila or the Philippines. But the Manila as hell image really starts to take shape in the mid to late 19th century. And it's very often expressed in the works of people like James McMicking, Nicholas Loney, and Charles Wilkes, who were sort of expatriate, usually people, traders and business people looking for commercial opportunities in Manila at that time. This being the time when the Spanish had sort of liberalized the Philippine economy and sort of opened it up for much more trade with foreign concerns. Or there are people like Charles Wilkes who are there. Charles Wilkes was a sailor with the US Navy who kept a diary and published it later. And these men are there. They are Anglo-Saxon Protestants, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and proud of it. What's interesting here is that they have much more disdain for what they see as this kind of corrupt, atavistic, religiously backward the Spanish colonial regime. They complain much more about that than they do about the Malay Filipinos, you know, the ordinary people, the colonial, the colonized sort of masses there. They are extremely critical of the way that they feel that the Spanish have sort of mismanaged the Philippines, you know, through corruption and through waste, and not applying a good Protestant work ethic to that particular society. And really, you reading between the lines of these sort of memoirs and pieces of travel writing, you start to see this sort of ulterior motive, which is that really these writers are calling for another empire, the empires that they represent, Britain, the United States, a Protestant empire, to come in and usurp the Spanish and to start managing Manila and the Philippines properly, you know, according to, as I say, this kind of very Victorian Protestant work ethic sort of ideology. I'm just to jump forward in time. Apologies, I'm going to be doing that quite a lot because, as I say, the canvas that I look at is rather large in the book, and the book's 300 pages, but I only have about sort of 40 minutes to kind of explain things. So I'm going to this is going to be edited highlights. So I'm going to be jumping around back and forward in time and between topic in a bit of a haphazard way, if you don't mind. So if we go forward and look at, for example, the ways in which Manila is hell is then, and by the way, I should say that a lot of the imagery that people like McMicking and Loney invoke is sort of, you know, the portrayals of, they portray sort of Spanish churches as being dark and shadowy places, you know, places you don't want to go to. So it's a kind of a light, sort of hellish atmosphere that they're invoking. It is not a kind of fiery, conflagratory sort of hell. That comes later really with World War II narratives, and there are so many of those. It's almost a kind of truism that very often, you know, the Western media, Western writers don't get interested in the non-Western world unless there's a crisis or some sort of catastrophe going on. And it takes the catastrophe of World War II and the Japanese invasion of Manila and the Philippines to really sort of kickstart a whole new sort of generation or a whole new phase of the Manila as hell trope, which is, you know, the portrayal of Manila as literally burning, you know, and of course Manila, as we know, suffered hugely you know, during the war in that sense. Post-independence, nominal independence in 1946 that obviously the Philippines achieves. There's an interesting, and this is a concept that I've borrowed from Mary-Louise Pratt, which is third world blues. And it's this, she applies it to travel writers like people like Paul Theroux and Alberto Moravia, and how they fetishize crime, poverty, authoritarianism, basically problems in the developing world or the third world or the global south, as we might call it now, and reduces these places to what she calls, and I like this quote, a joyless cityscape. And you find a lot of joyless cityscapes in post-war, in the work of someone like P.J. O'Rourke, who incidentally just died a few days ago, I believe, you know, the rather conservative American pioneer of kind of gonzo and new journalism. He wrote a lot, he visited the Philippines a lot in sort of 70s and 80s and wrote lots about it. The crucial thing about third world blues, and this is something that I'm going to return to, it's quite a major theme and quite a major concern of mine in the book. The crucial point for Pratt about third world blues is that there is this kind of hypocrisy to it, effectively, because what these writers do, including the ones she cites and the ones like P.J. O'Rourke, is that they deny any sort of complicity or blame that the West would have for these problems, you know. So in the case of the Philippines, it's the fact that the Philippines has remained effectively a sort of economically and geopolitically subordinate to the United States. If there is crime and poverty and these sorts of social problems, it is pretty much as a direct result of the Philippines' kind of subordinate relationship economically to the US. And instead of trying to explain, you instead have this sort of fetishizing of this situation. Going further into the 20th century, you have the writers, again, foreign correspondents, mostly like James Fenton and Ian Buruma, who visit the Philippines, and they're calling back to some of the ideas that were around in the 1840s and 50s. They are limning Manila and Manileños as superstitious and irrational and held back, held back by sort of strange beliefs, strange kind of atavistic and pagan type beliefs, This, I think, is an interesting contrast with what has been called techno-Orientalism by the critics Rowe, Huang, and Nui. I'm not sure if I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who talk about how at exactly the same time, in the sort of 1980s and 1990s, you have a different kind of fetishizing coming from Western culture, films, video games, literature, and so forth, about Asia. But it's rooted in sort of anxieties about the more prosperous nations of Asia, like Japan and China, being sort of overly technological and therefore being a sort of threat to Western power and Western regnance. Whereas intriguingly, the Philippines is sort of left behind. The Philippines has not been allowed to join that sort of order of techno-orientalized nations, right? I mean, for, again, fairly obvious sort of material reasons. Also, part of this generation of writers, people like Fenton and Buruma, are interested in the sort of, at the top of this kind of hellish, hell-like sort of superstitious, weird Manila, is the image of the cacique leader. And people who are familiar with the work of people like Reynaldo Eleto, who's done a lot of interesting work about the cacique sort of archetype of the brash, violent political boss or leader, again rooted in a certain sort of truth and about the way that these men operated, but in Eleto's view, very much kind of exaggerated and fetishized by succession of not just Western sort of literary writers, but also Western analysts and historians of the Philippines. So you see that kind of, like very much bossing or ruling this sort of hell-like Manila is this kind of demonic, slightly demonic sort of cacique type leader. And this takes us up to the work of someone like Jonathan Miller in his book Duterte Harry, which is a kind of, it's somewhere between a biography of Duterte and a work of investigative journalism about the drug war, the so-called drug war that's going on. And he doesn't use the word cacique, but he very much portrays Duterte as being the ultimate cacique, vain, brash, impulsive, violent, misogynistic, and also, which again is not without its, it's not saying that we know what Duterte says, we know what he thinks from his statements, his appalling misogynistic statements and the way that he behaves as a politician. But what's perhaps more problematic than that is that Miller, again, this is where there's a sort of an interesting link back to the work of Gros-Richard, because Gros-Richard talks about this kind of master and slave dynamic that seems to characterize the portrayals by these French Enlightenment writers of the Middle East. Miller uses much of that same sort of language. There's this notion that for someone like Duterte to succeed, there must be a sort of docile or credulous electorate, people who fall for this kind of stuff. If that is the case, then it's true of many other countries too, including mine, where we have a particularly authoritarian right-wing conservative government as well. So again, it's that sort of double standard that's being applied here. That it's only in the Philippines that, according to Miller and these sorts of writers, that people will be credulous enough to fall for such a leader. And there's no real sort of self-reflection or reflection on how these sorts of political processes play out in the West or elsewhere. And just carrying on that theme, there's a chapter in the book called Call of Duterte, another bad pun, excuse me. And this is where it links back to what I said earlier with this sort of notion of liberal Orientalism and the sort of liberal rhetoric about the Philippines that is often kind of mobilized here. And again, they're not wrong. Many contemporary pundits, including people like Miller, also Jonathan Katz, a number of Western journalists, are very critical of Duterte. They invoke the liberal language of international law, human rights, gender equality, and so forth. But when it comes to analyzing how and why Dutertismo came to be and why it succeeded, the analysis becomes very narrow and becomes, I would argue, sort of Orientalist or neo-Orientalist. The blame lies with variously the sort of limitations of Philippine institutions, the kind of pathological problems at the heart of Philippine governance, Philippine civil service, whatever, and so forth. Or China are blamed in what has been talked about by historians like Joseph Scalise as a kind of new Sinophobia, a new kind of anti-Chinese feeling, which a lot of liberals seem very keen to sign up to, I notice, both in the Philippines and beyond, if according to my sort of what I observed. So this is not without, we know that China has invested hugely in the Philippines since Duterte came to power. We know that's true, but what you won't find out from these sorts of these particular pundits is that actually Duterte is being supported by lots of other countries, including the countries and states that these pundits would like to think are bastions of human rights and democracy and liberalism. So I'd hate to say my country, I don't really feel a citizen of anywhere really, but the country from where I'm speaking to you now has sold £93 million worth of military equipment to Duterte since he came to power. That's a 900% increase on what was sold to Aquino over 8 years, right? EU countries have sold 300 million euros worth of arms and military equipment in the last 3 years. And the United States, as of a few months ago, was in the process of selling $2 billion worth of Black Hawk assault helicopters. So none of this is talked about. Again, it's a very partial, very limited sort of analysis that you get from these Western pundits. The other point to make is that the longer range causes of Dutertismo are not really discussed as well by such writers and journalists. Walden Bellio, the Filipino theorist of globalization, activist theorist, talks about the neoliberal breakdown that Philippine society went through as a result of the effectively being having to take on the policies of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, getting into huge amounts of debt, having to destroy trade unions, having to clamp down on domestic businesses, turning the Philippines into increasingly an export economy and so on and so forth. This is something that Bellio and the Fertitario also point to. And the notion here, which again is not really talked about amongst these sort of Western writers and journalists, is that the alienation and the despair caused by this, longer term, this sort of last 40, 50 or so years, 30, 40 years rather, of neoliberal breakdown, sort of helped to generate the conditions for Dutertismo. When people are suffering, when there is poverty, when there's unemployment, history shows us that people will turn to the guy who comes in and says, the demagogue who says that I can fix this, with some authoritarian policies and so forth. Yeah. So yes, that kind of liberal Orientalism is nothing new. We can go back to a number of texts from the late 19th, early 20th century, what I mentioned colonial adventure stories. Some of them are very brazen and very brash. Others are a little bit more subtle in their approaches, very much in keeping with the sort of rhetoric that the Americans used when they conquered the Philippines, you know, and in the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War. This notion that unlike the old European empires of Britain and France and so forth, America was trying to bring democracy and freedom. And, you know, you see the language of sort of aid and tutelage and so forth being used, not only in the official discourse, but also in these pretty execrable sort of pulp fictions of the time. If anyone here is a fan of the Hardy Boys or the Nancy Drew mysteries, you may be aware that they were generated by a fiction factory that was run by a guy called Edward Stratemeyer. Well, Stratemeyer, less famously, Stratemeyer's fiction factory was responsible. This is where basically writers got together like a committee and worked together to produce these books. And they produced a series called the Old Glory series, which are these kind of very stirring kind of boys' own colonial adventure novels where usually young men who are kind of runaways or orphans go and fight in the Philippines. But instead of doing what we know American soldiers did in the Philippines, in real life, which was horrific war crimes, killing women and children, burning down villages, strategic hamleting and so forth, they are portrayed as heroes. They are rescuing women and children, and they are there to bring, they're there to save the Malay Filipinos, the ordinary Filipinos, from the evil clutches of the revolutionaries like Aguinaldo and General Luna and people like that, right? So not very subtle, written, as I say, by committee in the way that I suppose nowadays TV sitcoms are, like The Simpsons, although I wish these books were even halfway as entertaining as an episode of The Simpsons, or halfway as cerebral as an episode of The Simpsons. I want to, it's all getting a bit testosterone, isn't it? So I've been talking a lot about kind of male and masculinist type themes, but it's also very important to talk about, and another big theme of the book is the way that Manila has been genderized. And this is where I'm going to get a bit nervous, because I'm going to try and paraphrase an idea from Professor Gonzalez, who's going to be speaking to you shortly. I hope she's not annoyed with me if I kind of get this wrong, although she does have the opportunity to come in later and critique me if I have misrepresented her. I hope I haven't. But this is an idea in her excellent book, Securing Paradise, which I could thoroughly recommend to everybody here. If you haven't, you should have read it already, but if you haven't, I would recommend reading it, please, because there was a very many powerful ideas in there, but one that struck me was this one. And I found that, it's a wonderful feeling when you discover someone's idea and you can then find ways of sort of applying it to different contexts and different objects of inquiry. And her point is that the genderizing of the Philippines has been a sort of a metaphor, really, for American domination of the Philippines, culturally, socially, militarily, definitely, economically, and so forth. So its domination of the Philippines has historically been propelled by a male imperial fantasy of securing a feminized, submissive periphery, receptive to and in need of being claimed, vindicated by deeply felt understandings of American rescue, liberation, benevolence, love, and allegiance. And again, you see that kind of fluffy, seemingly liberal sort of language and vocabulary being used there. I want to just share with you a particular scene, really, from Jack Curzon, or Mysterious Manila, by Archibald Clavering Gunter. What a name, eh? Archibald Clavering Gunter. Very kind of elaborate late Victorian sort of name, isn't it? This is a pretty sort of poor middlebrow sort of novel that comes out in 1899 that is really sort of cashing in on the American adventure in the Philippines, right? So the protagonist, called Jack Curzon, he's a British clerk working in Singapore. He falls in love with Maisie Gordon, who is a beautiful mixed American Filipina, sort of American mestizo, I suppose you would call her, whose looks have captured the hearts of the United States Navy. So he pursues her and he goes to the Philippines, and without having got time to go too much into the plot, but you know, you may want to read it, you may not want to read it. I wouldn't recommend reading it, it's not that good. I read these books so that you don't have to. So he pursues Maisie into the Philippines against a background of deepening US involvement. This is during the Philippine Revolution, which presages the Spanish-American War by a couple of years, right? And there's this sort of very cloak and dagger sort of intrigue that happens, you know, during the early stages of the sort of American involvement in the Philippines. To cut a long story short, a long and boring story short, Jack gets with Maisie as they ride away in a carriage happily ever after. This is where Gonzalez's sort of metaphor becomes really interesting, because this is sometimes, you know, being a literary critic, it's hard to decode these sorts of sequences, but this was very easy, because what happens is they ride off into the sunset. An Irish-American soldier who's been involved in that kind of you know, the American campaign says, "Why are these beauteous brides like these same blessed Dewey Islands?" So he's making a direct comparison. They're calling them the Dewey Islands, named after Admiral Dewey, right? Which is you know, rather insulting. To which his senior officer replies, "Because they'll be almighty ticklish critters to handle." So there's a very direct likening between, you know, finding a woman, finding an American Filipina, pursuing her and sort of and conquering her, as you like, as it were, and conquering the Dewey Islands, the Philippines, right? Maisie laughs at this, so she accepts it. She's been sort of interpolated into this kind of way of looking at, you know, the sort of imperial expedition. And the Irish-American further compares Filipino women with American imperial ambitions by stating that the Germans wanted them and couldn't get them, you know, because guys are, you know, in the way that guys, red-blooded guys, compete for women, and there are rivalries between them in the way that red-blooded empires will compete with each other for the bonanza of a colony like the Philippines, right? And it ends with, after more laughter, symbolizing the sort of concord between these characters, there's this sort of happy, as I say, concord between, you know, Jack and the Irish-American who's in the US Army, the British guy, the American guy, and the Filipino mestizo woman, and the commanding officer. Curzon steps into his carriage where a little fluttering beauty gathers in her gauzes to make room for Senor Jack Curzon. So Jack Curzon has sort of become Hispanized as well, which is an interesting little, you know, this to, I suppose, represent the fact that the you know, the WASPs, the Protestants have superseded the Spanish, the Catholics, as the new bosses of the Philippines. But they're going to be so much nicer, aren't they, because of all this talk of benevolent assimilation and aid and tutelage and so forth. Just again, jumping almost 100 years into later in time to a different way of genderizing Manila. This is from, I don't know if anyone is aware of the tabloid press in Britain, but it's a pretty awful sort of sector of our media. It always has been. I don't know if Neil Gaiman, British fantasy writer who is very popular amongst Filipinos. I think he was famous in the Philippines before he was famous in the West. He started out writing for the British tabloid newspapers, and he said he quit because he realized that you could publish almost anything, true or false, in those papers and no one would care. So he moved away from that and thankfully moved into you know, writing the stuff that he's now famous for. So there's a British Daily Mail article from 1988, which is a kind of piece of reportage, dare I say. Can I honor it with that term? I'm not sure. I mean, it's a piece of journalism that is written in a first person, from a first person perspective, where the journalist is the sort of center of the story, you know, in the way that someone like P.J. O'Rourke or Joan Didion, you know, but this writer is nowhere near as talented as those writers. And I'm just going to give you a couple of quotes from here. I don't mean to be too text heavy with these slides. So immediately here, all the way past that. So, but what this woman has done, Sarah Barrett, which is oddly enough my mother's maiden name, just by sheer coincidence. I'm pretty sure I hope my mum was not working for right-wing tabloid newspapers in Britain in the 1980s. No, she was bringing me up, so it's okay. My mum's Sarah with an H on the end as well. So yeah. So straight away, the actual physical geography of Manila is likened to the rather sort of horrid kind of pleasure that you know, Manila offers Western men. This is an article about Western men who have gone to get mail order brides, as they used to call them, young Filipinas who are poor and desperate to get with you know, Western men. Unfortunately, some of these habits die hard, right? So all the way past the Hyatt Hotel in Manila, where the palm trees with white painted trunks look like schoolgirls in bobby socks. So even the trees sort of remind this woman of a kind of landscape of jaded male desire, right? But she's not writing about it critically. She's fetishizing it, as we'll see. These mail order brides, she writes, are eager to perform maid duties and provide sex. You know, of course they are. You know, they're always eager, aren't they? You know, one of the interviewees, Gloria Camit, 28, has a neat little face and chocolate eyes. So that's your kind of, you know, sort of reflex racism of the sort of British correspondent there. And then Barrett quotes, perhaps most distressingly, without judgment, Gloria's declaration, "I'm not afraid of a man trying to make me a slave," you know. So there you go. That kind of speaks for itself, I think. I realize I haven't got much time left, so I'm just going to sort of quickly try and share with you some of the other ideas that and themes that I grapple with. As a sort of somewhat contradictory to the idea of Manila as hell is what I call Manila as a sort of flawed simulation or simulacrum, which is where you get a lot of these Manilaist writers who whose adumbrations very much show Manila to be this kind of second-rate imitation, a crude kitsch spoof of New York or Los Angeles or some sort of Western metropolis or city, which, you know, there are obvious kind of material reasons for why that sort of attitude might pervade some of this writing, of course, you know, not least since the Philippines had become a kind of formal colony of the US after you know, from about 1900. And again, jumping through time, in 1914, the American travel writer William Boyce is very happy with the way Manila is being developed by the American colonialists. He's happy with the Manila Hotel. He says it's as luxurious and comfortable as any American could desire, but it has this kind of telltale flaw, it has this problem, because it falls short of delivering bread and pie like mother used to make, right? So it's a rather banal, trivial, it's sort of like, it's good, but it's not quite there. There are a number of reasons why this may be the case. You know, a fear that if the colonized society starts to be a little bit too much like the, you know, if the periphery starts to be too much like the metropole, then it starts to challenge these sorts of notions of difference and supremacy, you know, the master-slave sort of dynamic that we've been talking about. Jumping forward to World War II, in the memoir of Claire High Pockets Phillips, curious sort of nickname, isn't it? An American spy, a woman who started off as a club singer, American woman, went to Manila, was a club singer, entertained all the soldiers and the colonial sort of, you know, colonial sort of upper class there. But then when war broke out, she became an American spy and actually had this quite dramatic sort of experience afterwards. And the way that the flawed simulation shows itself is somewhat more kind of dramatically in her case, because she talks about Manila as this kind of weird hypnagogic Hollywood-esque sort of place. She talks about the romantic setting of the ultra-modernistic Alcazar Club, the most attractive residential area of Mita. She's spelt wrong in this, in her thing, or maybe it's spelt like that previously, I don't know. You can maybe, someone can maybe fact check that for me. And there's this, you know, she falls in love. It's all very Hollywood. She falls in love with with an American soldier who's there, and they're constantly speaking of, you know, how they can't wait to sort of get back to America and you know, be on the you know, sort of hiking through the Rocky Mountains and things like that. But throughout, this sort of, as I say, this kind of fantastical sort of kind of adumbration of Manila is always being kind of is slowly being chipped away at by the sort of feudalistic kind of poverty that she sees, and the kind of sickness and the flies everywhere, and the, you know, the desperate straits that ordinary Filipinos are going through, ordinary Manileños are having to suffer. And also increasingly, because this is in, you know, she's there in 1941, late 1941, there's this awareness that the Japanese are about to invade. There are practice blackouts. There's news coming from other parts of Southeast Asia about the kind of the Japanese army advancing. So that's the sort of flaw in that particular simulation. Later on in the coming up to the sort of 1990s and 2000s, there are writers who are interested in this kind of notion of Manila as a simulation, but I suppose in a more kind of knowing and ironic postmodern way. And you find in the work of the novels of Alex Garland, whose book The Tesseract is from about 1997 or 8, I think, and also in a couple of Timothy Mo's novels, British Chinese writer Timothy Mo's novels, you see that there's this kind of reaching for all these kind of types from, you know, Western pulp fiction and Hollywood film and so forth. So these sort of hitmen in Manila that seem like they're out of a Quentin Tarantino film. And there's even, you know, Timothy Mo's quite blatant about it. A Manileño mobster called Don Pepe resembles a Mexican bandido El Jefe from a Sam Peckinpah movie. There's that very knowing sort of culture, sort of intertextual sort of culture jamming sort of take on this as well, which is, as I say, a kind of more recent iteration of the notion of Manila as a simulation. There's also, I'm also interested in the book in the way that certain communities within Manila are represented in these texts. The Chinese Filipino community is evidence that Manilaism is often conditioned by, or the attitudes behind Manilaism is often conditioned by not only events in Manila and the Philippines, but also certain kind of perceptions, Western hegemonic perceptions at certain times throughout history about elsewhere in Asia, about what's going on in Europe, about what's going on in the US, and in you know, the not just the US, but in the continents of the Americas, right? So the Chinese Filipinos are kind of they epitomize this in that sense, because they are seen as a kind of what I call a contradictory cocktail of both, you know, there are reasons to admire them, but also to disdain them as well. A lot of these writers that I've mentioned already, certainly the ones from the kind of Victorian and late Victorian period, will talk about how the Chinese Filipinos are admirable because they're enterprising, they seem to be good at business, they have this kind of financial acumen, but they are somehow kind of economically threatening at the same time. You know, they threaten the jobs of, you know, the Malay Filipinos and other groups within Manila. Another kind of contradiction there, or another sort of dialectic there, if you like, is that the Chinese are often constructed as being politically subversive. There's a character in Jack Curzon called Ah Kai, who is this kind of suspicious Chinese agent who is warned that he needs to sort of cool it, or the Spanish regime is going to arrest him and do God knows what to him. Politically subversive, yet at the same time pusillanimous and willing to let people walk all over them, you know, metaphorically, of course. And this attitude, this kind of particularly contradictory and weird sort of attitude, is shaped by attitudes towards not only the Chinese and the Philippines, and we know how historically marginalized and persecuted the Chinese Filipinos have been, going back to the very beginning, even before the Spanish era, I think I'm right in saying. Attitudes to them, which were no doubt sort of those Manilaists who were resident in Manila picked up those attitudes, no doubt from Malay Filipinos and Spanish Peninsulares and people like that while they were there. But there's also, you see that a lot of these constructions are conditioned by attitudes towards Chinese migration to the UK and the US in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially those fears about sort of economic dominance and so forth. And then more recently, the Chinese nations, you know, the actual nation of China, as in Beijing, China, its economic rise in the 1990s to the present, and its perceived connections to the Chinese in the Philippines, and what sort of why that needs to be feared and why there should be anxiety about that. Just to finish off, and this is, I really apologize for this being all too brief, because it doesn't do justice to the importance of this topic. And one of my regrets about the book is that the sort of fairly longish chapter is nonetheless not long enough, really, that I devote to this. And I think there's probably lots more work, probably for scholars more able than I to developing this. And this is, you know, simply what I call anti-Manilaism, where you have these dominant discourses, these dominant, very oppressive discourses. There is always, thankfully, resistance and reaction and dissent to those. And I'm, you know, I talk about a number of both Filipino writers, and it's obvious that there should be Filipino writers that would want to kind of object to and react to these sorts of canards and stereotypes and so forth. But there are also a number of enlightened foreign writers, Western writers, who have contested, satirized, and in other ways sort of deconstructed Manilaism, whether consciously or not. We mentioned the way that kind of postmodernism was mobilized by people like Mo and, you know, in quite vulgar ways, in quite reactionary ways, but actually there are some excellent recent novels by writers like Gina Apostol, Jessica Hagedorn, that brilliantly parody some of Manilaism's kind of assumptions, using, as I say, that kind of experimental parodic sort of approach. There are attempts to address third world blues by everyone from the Filipino novelist Jose Y. Delisay to the Australian writer Tom Bamforth, who is also an aid worker. So I wonder if that kind of professional positionality, you know, gives him a different sort of agenda to the sort of, you know, salaried journalist or the, you know, the tabloid journalist or whatever, right? And those writers try to actually very overtly reflect on the sort of material reasons, the material drivers of the sort of poverty and alienation that a lot of these Manilaist topographies fetishize and generally report on rather disrespectfully. They're also, again, kicking against that third world blues notion of writers like Amadis Guerrero, who in his sort of memoir and travel writing, tries to offer an alternative Manila whose coordinates of working class hope, agency, solidarity, and community are ignored by the Manilaist sign system. They're not dramatic enough, they're not depressing or miserable enough to make for a good Orientalist type story. There's also a certain amount of self-reflexive acknowledgement of the fallibility and ethical risks of a Western observer trying to represent Manila in the work of the Australian writer Maslin Williams and the American writer Rafe Bartholomew, as a counter to what you often find this notion, what David Spur calls the commanding view of, you know, colonialist or Orientalist writers who feel that their judgments, their representations of the non-Western world are sort of beyond reproach and cannot be challenged and should not be challenged, and are somehow kind of natural or commonsensical. So yes, I will stop there because I think I've gone over my time, but at least I hope that gives you some sort of flavor of what my book is about. Thank you. I will stop sharing now, shall I? Yeah.
Wow, that was amazing in such a short time. I'm sure that people will now be more interested in reading the whole book just to get the, you know, more detail about what you just talked about. And for today, we also have with us Bernadette Gonzalez, who is Professor of American Studies and Director of the Honors Program at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her areas of research include studies of tourism and militarism, transnational cultural studies, feminist theory, postcolonial studies, with a focus on Asia and the Pacific. She has a PhD in ethnic studies from University of California, Berkeley, with a designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality. Her most recent book, Empire's Mistress, starring Isabel Rosario Cooper, is an exploration of the intimacies of imperial geopolitics through the life of a mixed-race vaudeville and film actress and sometime mistress of General Douglas MacArthur. She is co-editor of Detours, The Colonial Guide to Hawaii, which curates alternative place-based narratives, art, and itineraries that present a decolonial archive and vision for life in Hawaii. Her first book, Securing Paradise, which Tom mentions, won the Association for Asian American Studies Book Award for the best book in cultural studies, published in 2013. Please welcome Dr. Bernadette Gonzalez with her reaction to Tom's lecture.
Thanks, Pia. Aloha kako, mabuhay sa inyong lahat. Thank you, Tom, for your compelling and fascinating and very full presentation. I learned a lot about the narrative density of Manilaism as a kind of discourse and its legacies in the contemporary moment. There were a lot of ideas presented, so I'm going to try to pick through just a few here to get us started, to linger over. And these will be filtered through my own research interests. So I want to make sure to invite the audience to please post their questions in the chat, so that we get a chance to hear from you as well, because my commentary and my questions are not going to be comprehensive by any means. I won't even try. I think first that I have to approach this meditation on the literary production of Manila from the point of view of a provinciana. This was how a fellow Filipina, whom I met in graduate school at Berkeley, and who was raised in the metropole, reacted when we introduced ourselves to our cohort. And I'm not sure it was meant to be a compliment. I was taken aback. In my mind, I did understand the centrality of the Manila experience as the defining experience of the Philippines, at least from the point of view of the outside. But having lived all my life prior to emigration on the island of Negros and the Visayas, a rural island experience to me was more viscerally representative of the Philippines. Manila, to me, was the distant former home of my maternal grandmother, who was bitter about being exiled to the provinces due to her husband's labor organizing. Manila was the place where a rare visit to some relatives placed me in disorienting geographies of concrete and traffic. It was a place where I couldn't map my location relative to the mountains and the sea, which is how I had always, grown up understanding where I was. So my perceptions of Manila were shaped by television shows, news, and comics, especially, that I would sort of find in my Lola's bodega, that centered the capital in particular ways, and in whispered bits of urban myth about kidnappings of children and other kinds of violence. So in the provinces too, these misrepresentations of the capital filtered through. So I wonder to what extent local, provincial ideas of the capital borrow from the sedimented histories of storytelling that Tom describes, and what might also be original to them. Tom has laid out a case for the power of representation, or rather misrepresentation, and how these imaginaries come to have a kind of material shape and force that are employed toward control and extraction. We see this, of course, here in Hawaii, right? Working in parallel, but maybe with different and possibly opposing, but related sets of religious images. So in the representation of Hawaii as paradise, right? So we have Manila as hell, and Hawaii as heaven or paradise. So here we can track the ways too in which travelogues, journalism, military and diplomatic reports, and the power of intertextuality and citation, the repetition of these kinds of truths, right, produce a fantasy holiday destination for the consumption of others. So in contrast, the sedimented ideas about Manila, at least the ones in mainstream circulation that Tom talks about, both the brute narratives of white supremacy and the liberal modes of Manilaism, draw on a different grammar, but one that is nonetheless based on fantasy and desire. So because I do my work somewhat in the mode of thinking through linkages, but not necessarily comparison, my first question, if it is a question, has to do with the ways in which these narratives of Manila or Hawaii or other sites exist in relation to each other, right? So I'm kind of trying to think through, how do we think of Manila as something that also exists in relation to other places, such as the paradise or the heaven of Hawaii in this case. So one could argue that the obverse of heaven is hell, and these two sides of US colonialism and occupation are not opposites, but rather two sides of the same coin, and also constitutive of the other. So how do these depictions of Manila operate alongside and in relation to other sites of imperial occupation and fantasy? And I'm not sure that you cover this necessarily, right? But this is like a provocation on my part. So what are the stories of power and narrative that we can learn from the tropes and genres that are conjured for these tales and the way that they are constructed in opposition to each other? So, okay. So as we've learned from Edward Said, who grew up chewing on Edward Said's theories of Orientalism and empire, who's Tom cites as one of the foundational theorists of how the Orient, this idea of the Orient came to be. These kinds of narratives, right, the stories that sort of get repeated, are not mere exercises of fantasy and creativity. Rather, they exist in particular conditions of power and are enlisted to do certain kinds of work, particularly in the context of empire building and the maintenance of power. I wonder though, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about, just because there's a perversity, right, in the ways we think about power, because you're always thinking about the incompleteness of power, right? About the role of pleasure in the generation, circulation, and consumption of these kinds of narratives, and the production of this kind of work. So my second set of question kind of builds on the first, right? At the level of the individual and of social imagination, what's the story of power and pleasure, right? What are the pleasures of authority? What are the pleasures of fantasy? And how do these pleasures fit into the larger narratives that shape our understandings of place and of Manila in particular? And I know that's a really kind of fuzzy question. So maybe I can try to kind of get to a little bit more of what I mean. There are, of course, deeply problematic and powerful ways in which these narratives rely on and propagate ideas about race, gender, sexuality, and place, as you point out, especially in how Filipino women in particular come to be metonyms of for the occupation and consumption of the nation, right? So you also argue that these narratives continue to be put to work today, both on the level of geopolitical statecraft and sort of continuing culture of fantasy around the Philippines. So the reason why I detoured through the question of pleasure and fantasy also relates to the question of race, gender, and sexuality and place. Is there room to recuperate, and I think you gesture to this in the end of your talk, right? And generate alternative relations that look to these modes of difference as places of affiliation rather than extraction, right? To think through sexuality as a place of affiliation rather than extraction. And this is something I kind of grappled with a little bit in Empire's Mistress, where the overdetermined tale of MacArthur's paramour, right, the sort of doomed romance, becomes the only one that becomes legible. And it's the only one that we can kind of use to approach the story of Isabel Cooper. So this tragic romance plot that really actually ends up saying more about the desires of the colonizer rather than the actual life of this woman. So I was interested in the ways in which the kinds of writers that you focus on in your talk were male writers, right? And they had a particular kind of orientation towards the Philippines. So I'm kind of wondering about the women, because women wrote about the Philippines. The teachers, the wives of diplomats and bureaucrats, they too have a particular kind of archive and orientation to Manila. And, Amy Kaplan talks a little bit about the sort of manifest domesticity of the kinds of ways they tried to think through Manila and approach Manila. So relatedly, kind of, I'm trying to make this cohesive. So your title alludes to third world blues. So I'd like to hear more about this. And you talked about how this is an idea from Mary-Louise Pratt and the way that she writes about joyless cityscapes, or she thinks through the ways in which joyless cityscapes become a particular kind of trope to elide the West's responsibility and role in the social problems that do exist in these urban landscapes. So I'm not at all a music scholar. Okay, so let me start there. I am the one Filipino who cannot do karaoke. I need a lot of rum in order to actually to sing a recognizable tune, and Pia knows this. So she has tried to make me sing karaoke. So I'm not a musical scholar nor a performer. But I think that to invoke the blues, right, is to tap into a particular narrative form of the African diaspora that pulls together traditions of work songs. And I'm trying to get to ideas of how there might be different ways to narrate, right, through, and to think about the blues here. Work songs, spirituals, country music, as well as oral traditions that involve call and response and improvisation. So common themes of the blues were very melancholy, right, including they included tales of loss and injustice. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to how you're thinking through the genre and the form of the blues, since it's in your title, as structures that narrate the so-called third world. Again, I'm working on the ways in which race, gender, sexuality filter through in narrative content, but also in form. And what pleasures, right? The blues are pleasurable to listen to, they're beautiful. What pleasures there are to be had in these turns and the kinds of affiliations that the blues sort of create, the kinds of community, right? So how might a tradition of grieving, lamentation, and resistance from the Africanist tradition open up possibly some ideas about an anti-Manilaism? Okay, so let me see, what else do I have to say? So some of these other ideas about pleasure and knowledge about the city relate to the counter narratives that Tom presents as an alternative archive of the city. Just as Manila is misunderstood, whether deliberately or through mistranslation, it is also deeply understood and loved by Filipino writers who center it through an entirely different lens. So here we see the power of placemaking and narrative at work taken up by its actual residents. And it's a different picture indeed, one of a complex home that is lived in, that is cozy, that is protective, that has these spaces for community and political affiliation. So I'm really interested in the power of authorship and translation in pulling a different kind of place into being, manifesting them, if you will. And this comes through in my work on editing a decolonial guide to Hawaii. Detours is a way to kind of counter, is an attempt to do the same thing, which is both to recognize and decenter the power of the travel guidebook in its framing of Hawaii, and to empower place-based projects of decolonial knowledge that can lead to sovereignty in this place. And by sovereignty, I mean, I'm defining it as land back, as return to and of the land to Native Hawaiians. So I wonder about the horizon too of Manila is anti-Manilaism. What does it have in its sights for the folks who work in the city, who live and die in it? You know, and I've read Apostol, I've read Hagedorn. So I'm kind of wondering what you feel is the alternative kind of desire that is posited, alternative kind of future that is posited in these kinds of narratives. So what does their love for the city gesture toward and hope for? Because I study tourism, I can't help but kind of put those side by side in the kinds of narratives that the state attempts to constantly position the Philippines as the safe place for investment in tourism, right? The sort of liberal narrative of liberal Orientalism, self-tropicalization that happens in the state narratives of tourism. So in closing, kind of circling back to the Provinciana who encountered Manila mostly through Filipino narratives, media, and rumor, and the rare visit, what might it mean to encounter Manila obliquely? what might it mean to decenter it also, right? As the place that becomes the definitive topos of the Philippines. What ideas of difference, of race, gender, and sexuality, of class might be generated from the margins encounter with the capital, from non-Tagalogs, from non-English speakers, from those from whom the primary mode is not writing. And this is not necessarily an example of that, but I was thinking about when you were talking about the sort of Hollywood archive, right, of the flawed simulations of Manila. I was thinking most recently about, well, the elections, right, that are coming up, and the kinds of news I'm mostly getting from social media feeds, right, of people kind of tracking different kinds of campaigns from relatives and friends in the Philippines. But I'm also thinking about Ramona Diaz's documentary about the Nobel Prize winning journalist Maria Reza and the work that she's done to expose Dutertismo and the manipulation, right, of false political narratives. Where do these kinds of narratives of Manila and the Philippines lie in the spectrum, right? So I'm trying to think through, and I don't know that I have a question about this, right? What are the kinds of ways in which alternative facts circulates, right, as part of this kind of new narrative and sort of new circuits of social media and the internet, and how they get amplified and sort of spread and disseminated in these new circuits that I think we need to really now learn about, right? Because they are powerful, powerful circuits and powerful narratives. And you don't necessarily need to be an author of Manilaism, right, to become a powerful disseminator of these kinds of alternative facts. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. I mean, do you want me to try and sort of respond to some of that, or do we, I don't know, should I have a look for any?
There's no questions yet in the chat,
yet.
but I again want to remind folks to please put questions and comments in the chat for Tom to engage with. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for those, please do feel free, and Pia and Kalam and other folks too may have ideas and responses themselves. So
can I just sorry, I'm looking at myself and I'm not very happy with what I'm seeing. Is there any way, I know I'm pinned, but is there a way that I can?
We're actually both spotlighted, so you and Professor Bernadette are on our screens.
Right.
Do you want to see the rest of them, you mean?
I just don't want to see myself, really, because I find it a bit off-putting.
Maybe put us on gallery view at this point.
Okay.
So it kind of encourages more of a classroom space.
Will do.
That's much better. Now I can just see Bernadette, and that's fine by me. So
no, unpin me too. Put us all on gallery mode, please.
Got it.
Okay.
On my everybody can just do their gallery mode. We've removed all the spotlights. So go ahead, Dr. Sykes.
Well, thank you, Bernadette. I mean, those were really cogent responses and really intriguing points to make. And just, really, I think potential sort of interesting points of departure for further research, because I hope this is not going to be the last time I engage with this topic. Just to respond to some of your points, I mean, just going from the top, yeah, I think that the kind of point about the provinciana kind of sort of attitude towards Manila, and how the urban and the rural experience is so different. I mean, I've spent a little bit of time in the province, as it's often called, and I'm aware, obviously, that there are sort of material differences and also differences in terms of the stories that people tell and the discourses that emanate from them. I suppose why focus on Manila then? Really, for the kind of reasons you mentioned, that it's often, I think it was James Hamilton Patterson who described it as Manila being the sort of teat from which the rest of the world, or the Western world, draws all its information from the Philippines. So that's not to sort of say that therefore the country beyond Manila is not worth kind of scrutinizing and looking at, of course. But I think what I tried to do in the book to a certain extent is, so for example, talking about the kind of notion of Manila as hell and these Western writers that sort of arrest Manila in this sort of pre-modern imagery. There's a lot of references to kind of, you know, like sort of mythology, pagan, what, you know, might be called sort of pagan ideas, whether it's the monsters like the aswang and things like that, which probably do come from elsewhere in the Philippines, and they've been sort of brought to Manila by people who have sort of migrated from the provinces, and then brought to the world, because those people often kind of migrate to places like Hawaii and the US and to Europe and so forth. So Manila is I think, yes, it's a different place. It's a different sort of textual space to other parts of the Philippines, but nonetheless, it sort of draws lots of sorts of cultural influences, and then makes them available for Westerners to misrepresent them, maybe, or to give this, to give their sort of, you know, to construct them in the way that they want to construct them. I think the idea around, yes, the contrast of Hawaii. I'm afraid I don't know much about Hawaii, in, you know, compared to, or at least in terms of some of the kind of, you know, Western constructions of it, or that you say the touristic constructions of it, next to Manila. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that, you know, and maybe this links to what you said about later on about kind of Manila's identity and how it is construed by Filipinos and also by non-Filipinos. And I think that, so this sort of notion of, you talked about kind of fantasy and desire. Yes, Manila, I don't think has ever really been construed as a sort of lovely sort of holiday type destination. Other parts of the Philippines have been represented that way. You know, so there is that kind of contrast, I guess. But where I suppose some kind of notion of, some jaded notion of pleasure comes out of that, nonetheless, is that there's a, you know, there's maybe the sort of notion amongst certain Western tourists and certainly Western writers that I've looked at, that traveling to Manila gives you, you know, and again, this is rather a kind of macho, masculinist kind of take on it, is that there's something to be, the very fact that it's quite the opposite to an easygoing utopian sort of holiday destination, is precisely where there can be some sort of libidinal pleasure drawn from it. You know, it's a challenge to go to Manila and risk the crime, and especially if you happen to go as a foreign correspondent during the Marcos era, or more recently in the era of Duterte's drug war, that you're sort of taking these risks and you get some sort of badge of courage at the end of it as a Western journalist or a Western reporter. You know, I talk about that you know, that sort of macho culture to a certain extent as it applies to, but the way that manifests itself tonally, actually, in the work of people like James Fenton and P.J. O'Rourke, is this sort of casualness, this kind of, I went to Manila in the middle and there was like, you know, the EDSA revolution going on and it was all crazy and I survived it. And as a Westerner coming from a much more privileged part of the world and that is much more peaceful, and we don't have these sorts of social catastrophes going on, I went there, I reported on it. And that also feeds into a longer tradition of what, you know, is often being called the serio-comic tone of travel writing, right? Whereby, you know, whatever challenges face the travel writer, they just kind of brush it off with a in the case of P.J. O'Rourke, a rather problematic sort of ethnocentric one-liner, or in the case of Fenton, it's this kind of casual Englishman abroad sort of, oh, there was a shootout over there, or there was a revolution over there, but it's kind of okay, I survived it. And so that in itself is a sort of, is that in itself a kind of touristic experience? I think it is, and again, speaking as someone who, back when it was more affordable, when the pound was stronger against other currencies, I, like a lot of, British kids my age, my generation, backpacked around Southeast Asia, and I noticed there that there was that kind of mentality of, throwing yourself, almost like competing between people as to sort of how much privation they could stand. Oh, well, I stayed in this slum over here. Oh, but I stayed in another slum that was even worse, and there was even more disease and even more depressing poverty, and that kind of one-upmanship. And I do emphasize the man syllable of that word. It did seem to be, I never heard women backpackers competing on these sorts of rather pathetic sort of terms. But so yes, I wonder if there's, as I say, there's a kind of notion of Manila being somewhere you can, that offers a kind of touristic experience, but it's not necessarily a relaxing, easy-going one by the beach. It's one that is, offers a sort of challenge or something to a certain mentality, at least. There was, just to sort of speak to what you had to say about a potential kind of counter discourse and a potential way of constructing Manila in, what is it Said says in Orientalism, in a sort of non-manipulative, libertarian, respectful kind of way, whether that's possible for Western writers. It certainly is possible for a number of Filipino writers, and I mentioned a few of them at the end of my talk. I mean, I'm reminded of Nick Joaquin's book, Language of the Street, which I think converts in a way, sort of offers maybe a solution or a response to that kind of third world bluesification of Manila, in the sense that what are seen to be weaknesses and problems and flaws by the Western writer, in the sense of the rather confused, jumbled sort of urban planning of Manila, in terms of Manila as this sort of, as a sort of mess in terms of its architectural styles and its, I think, is it James Hamilton Patterson says, a sense of history is hard won in Manila, in his book, Playing with Water. Someone like Joaquin, his counterstrike to that in a book like Language of the Streets is that actually that's the sort of contingency and the diversity and the heterogeneity of Manila is something that actually should be celebrated by Manileños, and part of that is sort of, I think this is intriguingly timely for our age of, the debates around pulling down statues that, support or celebrate problematic historical figures and so forth. Joaquin in that book, as I remember, warns against the renaming of streets after sort of nationalist heroes, as in favor of kind of, Americans or Spanish colonials and so forth, because, for him, it feels like that's to keep those names is a price worth paying to preserve some sense of Manila as this sort of historical palimpsest of different influences. So that might be one sort of response potentially.
Dr. Sykes, I'm going to interrupt you for now.
Yeah.
I wanted to open to the group here. We're almost out of time, but these are all very compelling. And I wish that there will be another opportunity for us to continue the conversation. But if there are any questions from the audience, or for those of you who are here, please go right ahead. You can unmute yourselves or turn on your videos. I think you've made yourself very clear, Dr. Sykes. There are no questions. However, this video is recorded, and we are going to post it on our websites, and we will be able to give information about you and how to contact you, Dr. Sykes, should there be any questions that will be coming from the websites also. So they can always contact us at CPS, that's Center for Philippine Studies, cps@hawaii.edu. So here to close our program is our Assistant Director, Dr. Federico Magdalena.
Thank you very much, Clem. Do you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
All right. I have another webinar in a few minutes, so I'll make my closing remarks very short and quick. Oh boy, somebody's calling me already. Oh boy, it's the meeting that I told you about. So anyway, I better not answer that one. Somebody's calling me to hurry up. First of all, I would like to congratulate Dr. Tom Sykes for a very wonderful presentation on the Manilaism that is contained in his book, and how other writers try to counter that view which portrays Manila, in a very different light. I just would like to make a little point. This is not a question or a comment or reaction against the presentation, but even among Filipinos, there is a very obvious anti-Manilaism going on. If you go to the south in other areas away from Manila, like Mindanao or Sulu, and those other places that have been marginalized and even perceived to be oppressed by the Manila Center, which is viewed like a colony or a neo-colony. Filipinos have a lot of stories. They don't write those stories, but you hear them, and they express those sentiments when election time comes. And I would say that this kind of anti-Manilaism in the periphery is usually expressed in a matter that is very, very subtle, like election. And I believe that this is one reason why Rodrigo Duterte got elected, as a revenge against the continuing marginalization of Mindanao and the other islands that have been forgotten by the center of civilization, which is Manila. So I guess even Filipinos internally make comments, although you mentioned writers like Jean Apostol and many others who are against this Manilaism portrayal of the center of the Philippines. So with that, I think we are now ready to close the program. And again, I reiterate my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Sykes for that very, very wonderful presentation. I wish I could read the book if it gets available nearby. Maybe it will be sold on Amazon, so I would probably order that one as soon as it is ready. Thank you.
Any words, last words from you, Dr. Sykes?
Thank you very much for having me. I mean, I'm really honored to be to have been invited and to have had such excellent commentary from Professor Gonzalez, Professor Magdalena. I mean, just in terms of the book, it is available in the US and the UK through Bloomsbury. I'm happy to send PDFs to people if they want to read it, because it is quite expensive. And this is, I don't understand this about academic publishing. It's you know, it somewhat kind of mitigates against some of the points I'm trying to make about, you know, these sort of inequalities and so forth when the book is so expensive. So I'm happy to share it. If you could have a copy in your library, that would be fantastic. And I hope that it would be a useful resource for your students and your colleagues. So
I'll connect with you about that, Dr. Sykes. We'll try to order it for our Hamilton library.
yeah, thank you.
Any
Thank you.
more? Go ahead, Dr. Arboleda.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Sykes, for this wonderful conversation. I just want to add just a few things. You know, I grew up in Manila all my life, and then I moved to Baguio City. And then when I moved to a different place, I didn't miss Manila at all. I missed Baguio. I think I'm guilty of that. Whenever I tell tourists, you know, when you come to the Philippines, just be in Manila for 2 hours and go to the neighboring islands. But I think there's a difference for me also. There's a difference between the Manila of old. Like when I look at pictures of old Manila, I feel so sad that it's no longer what it used to be. We used to have a tramvia, and, you know, Sundays in the park were usually very relaxing. I don't know what happened to our city. But there is redemption, as always. I hope there will be a few changes if, you know, a new regime comes in, because they've tried, you know, they've fixed Manila Bay. I mean, like physically, as well as like in terms of its political, in the political situation. But we cannot remove Manila from what's happening with the whole Philippines. There used to be a time when they didn't think Manila was in the Philippines, you know, in the 70s. It was like disco town or whatever. And then they say, what? Manila is in the Philippines. The Philippines, they think people live on trees. It was very terrible in that sense. So your lecture will become very, very useful when we discuss all this in our IP 370 class, which is Philippine Travelogue, that's focused on the different ethno-linguistic groups on the Philippines. So it's not Manila centered as we think. So we're doing north to south of the Philippines and really looking into the traditions and the peoples that live there, because every group and every part of the Philippines is different. And I think that I'd like for us to end on that note, to look at the cultural diversity of the Philippines. And in terms of Hawaii, I don't know what's worse, if they say it's paradise, then they have expectations about Hawaii, or they say, oh, Manila is really terrible. I think what we're looking at is the middle ground, and actually look at it from, what's actually happening, and not the fake news that we see that Bernadette talks about, in terms of not just the Duterte regime but even before then. And so thank you so very much for this wonderful talk, and I will post this video on Facebook as well, and it will be on our website for future reference. Thank you so very much, and I would like to thank of course Ms. Clemen Montero for putting this lecture together. Maraming salamat po, and have a great day, everyone.